While I don't intend to entertain such a discussion here, I am pretty neutral on the topic. It would be interesting to see how Sakurai approaches modern characters, but the first Air Raid was largely original too, with only a handful of references. Today it feels like the series cannot go one game without calling back every single title in the franchise, and it can quickly start to become forced. Star Allies as a celebration was fine, but not every entry needs to be like that. It was the high point of an already excellent announcement, but apparently not for everyone. You may have seen some concerned comments with fans wondering whether Sakurai will properly represent the Kirby titles he hasn't worked on. Margolor, Taranza, Suzy or Alphalin are so embedded in the franchise by now. It's hard to imagine a time when this wasn't the case. As a result, we speak of the classic Kirby era, everything up to Kirby 64 basically, and the modern era with Return to Dreamland and all its following installments. However, it's important to mention that Sakurai didn't even fully utilize classic Kirby's repertoire. As a fan, I would love to see more Kirby fighters, but I'm also honest enough to admit that there just aren't many must-have newcomers left in the series. Most other options are just fan favorites, rather than essential additions. They don't carry the same weight or demand as characters like Ridley or King K. Rool once did. Kirby, Meta Knight and DDD form the core triceps of the series, and they're probably the only characters players outside the fandom would recognize instantly. It's easy to get the impression that Sakurai either doesn't care about modern Kirby, favors his own past projects, or simply isn't a fan of the newer games. He even went the extra mile and copied a whole mold from Air Raid and Smash for 3DS. He must be so full of himself. But unlike most people on the internet, Sakurai is a grown professional man, and some of those assumptions are simply based on emotions. Personally, I don't believe he dislikes modern Kirby or secretly holds a bias towards his own entries. With only so many franchises to properly focus on, it's simply easier and more efficient for Sakurai to lean on the Kirby entries he knows best. Logically, the concerns surrounding Smash can be extended to Air Riders. No modern playable characters, no courses inspired by recent entries, and no acknowledgement of the evolving lore. In a fundraiser, really trying to stay neutral here. What people associate with Air Raid is a group of colorful Kirbys soaring on their stars. Air Raid's item system revolved around copy abilities, which is why only Kirbys were playable, while Meta Knight and DDD were limited to specific playstyles. The literal real stars of the show, and in a broader sense the playable characters, were the various vehicles themselves, each with distinct and unique attributes. I'm not pointing this out to sugarcoat the limited roster in Air Raid or potentially in Air Riders, but because it's simply a matter of design. If Air Riders once again bases its mechanics around copy abilities as items, including a wide range of characters with fixed skills could easily disrupt the game's balance. Air Raid was pretty unbalanced thanks to how drastically the stars differed from one another, and adding character-specific skills would only widen that gap even more. As I said, it's also important to recognize that Air Raid already stood firmly on its own. Sure, it featured Dynablade, a few classic soundtracks and some familiar enemies, but around 80% of the game was entirely original. It's speculative, but I feel like the people who are genuinely worried either didn't grow up with Air Raid or simply didn't love it as much as many of us did. So let's stop hating fun for a moment and just be grateful that father finally returned with the milk. Also, everyone's favorite character Magman appears, thank God! Otherwise Sakurai would be really biased.
Alright, I get it!
The shackles are broken and the Kirby agenda riders can finally rest. The original Air Raid also didn't feature any characters he hadn't created, and the teaser for Air Riders seemed to follow this pattern, showing only colorful Kirbys, which were essentially the only playable characters in Air Raid alongside DDD and Meta Knight, introducing so many modern references that it elevated Air Riders from a simple racing spin-off into a full-blown celebration of the Kirby franchise, effectively robbing Star Allies of its primary reason to exist. Also, if you need a logical explanation as to why they need to implement a regular Waddle Dee, you cannot be human. Although Sakurai's perceived bias was largely disproven with Air Riders, there's still a slight preference visible. Also, let's be a little human for a second. Imagine returning to your very first video game series after more than 20 years, and being given the opportunity to develop a high-budget title with all the resources you could ever need. You're allowed to create incredibly detailed, expensive CGI cutscenes, and the last time you worked with the original characters in the mainline title, pixel art was the standard. Of course you would take that chance. You would finally realize all those characters, worlds and concepts you originally created, now fully reimagined in high definition just as you may have always envisioned them. Anyone in that position would naturally feel inclined to use the opportunity and highlight their own creations one last time. So let's not pretend we wouldn't do the same. Personally, I don't believe he holds a bias towards his own entries.